Alright, ladies and gentlemen, this is the American Revolution Part 2. And from here we'll be discussing all of the elements that lead to the end of the war. After the fall of Saratoga and Washington's loss at Brandywine and Germantown, the British took over Philadelphia, and Washington was down in Pennsylvania, and so he decided to make his winter encampment at a place called Valley Forge. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time with these. I did include some videos online that you could take a look at that we discussed and showed in class about the wintertime encampments and how brutal and challenging they were. The first winter at Morristown, and then the second winter here at Valley Forge is probably the most famous of all. And we'll talk a little bit about the legacy. But each one of these encampments had an impact on the outcome of the war. And like I said, Valley Forge, probably more than any other, this winter encampment was so brutal. And like I said, you're welcome to watch the video segment that I've included. It had 14,000 men. They had no places to stay. They stayed on, dirt-floored little huts that they built. It was really brutal conditions, and they lacked everything possible you can imagine to keep an army sustained. And yet somehow they found a way to turn their Continental fighters into trained and disciplined soldiers, and a lot of that had to do with a lot of hope and a lot of help from the training by the Baron von Steuben, who made that possible. He did an incredible job getting these men to become more than what they ever thought they could be, and his training methods to this day are still used. And he turned us into an army that knew how to, basically going back to the tug of war reference, knew how to hold the rope correctly, and got us fighting like we needed to be. And so Valley Forge, again, played a pivotal role in how things shaped up. The second, Morristown, was after General Howe resigned, and Washington had to go back to New York and watch over where Clinton was at. Clinton, who took over for Howe, had his army in New York, and of course Morristown, number 2, was most famous for its brutal winter. I also included a video segment. You can take a look at that if you wanted to learn more. But these winter encampments at Morristown and Valley Forge really shaped the attitude and the spirit of the Continental people to win this war. After that, we went to the Forgotten Phases, where I gave you guys the stories, and we watched some of the video segments, all of which have been included on Edmodo, and you can take a look at those. The key component, no matter what, we had to have help from Europe. While the war was getting going, Europe, we needed every resource possible. And obviously, having Ben Franklin to be in France to kind of encourage the French to get involved was essential. The French would eventually, after Saratoga, sign the treaties, 1778, 2 different treaties that would recognize America as an independent country, and they would support us financially and with weapons and supplies and resources and men. But that would take time to get here. Spain also would join in the process in 1779 and help us on the high seas, pretty much distracting the British down in the Caribbean. And ultimately, that's what it did. France and Spain were forced Great Britain to fight a war on multiple fronts, especially in the West Indies and out at sea, because we didn't have much of a navy, and that was one of the forgotten phases that we talked about. The war at sea, when we did emphasize it, John Paul Jones, privateers. We didn't have much of a fleet at all. He did make a famous attack on the warship the Serapis, defeating it just off the coast of Great Britain. And John Paul Jones, to this day, is still known as the father of our Navy, with his famous quote, "I have not yet begun to fight." His success, obviously, against the best Navy in the world, pretty much inspired Americans that, hey, we got an opportunity. Not only that, but it demoralized the British, who saw it happen and unfold right in front of their eyes. Here's an illustration of that event. But anyway, John Paul Jones, famous character, historical figure, one of those guys that, it had an impact, but really it was very minimal with regard to the outcome of the war, but it helped in the attitude and the spirit of the Americans and what they took out of the war. And like I said, the Navy to this day still gives him a lot of credit for, founding our Navy. So. Another forgotten phase was the war in the West, and I showed you guys this map to emphasize the lakes, because there kind of gives you a reference. But basically, the war in the West was about the British trying to recruit Native Americans. They had a guy out there that we stood up against the movement out in the West with George Rogers Clark, and he went out to pretty much defend the Ohio River Valley and stop the Native Americans from attacking settlements. Harebuyer Hamilton was the guy's name, who was paying for the Native Americans to scalp our settlers, and he was using the Native Americans against us, and George Rogers Clark was successfully able to defend that frontier. I did include that video as well. You're welcome to take a look at it if you need a refresher, but it pretty much happened way out there on the far side of your map, Kaskaskia, Cahokia, and Vincennes, and it would be at Vincennes where Harebuyer Hamilton was he was tricked into believing that George Rogers Clark had a huge army, and he didn't have a very big army, but he intimidated him into surrender, which was pretty awesome. And the way that happened was, if you go back to this map, or go back to the map, these guys crossed over, brutal 180-mile trek across the worst land possible, swampy area, and were able to get the British to surrender. And it was very impacting as far as with regard to the western frontier. When the revolution ended, we were able to lay claim to that land in the west because of what George Rogers Clark did. Then back a little closer to where Washington was at. Also, I showed you on the map there is the Indian raids that took place in Pennsylvania and New York, and this set the tone for how Washington and the rest of our government from here on out until the 1890s would handle Native American issues. He declared war on the Native Americans because of the brutal raids and what was going on. So, like I said, this set a standard for how the Americans would perceive Native Americans from now on. Again, there's a look right here. Sullivan marches up and ends up fighting, Johnson and the Indians and Loyalists and Indian raids here, trying to protect, everything that's over here in the New England area.